is something that I've wanted to do for a little while because people keep asking me about it. And that is, I want to do just a brief overview of what are some of the basic Lutheran systematic theology textbooks that you can get a hold of. And depending on what you're looking for, what is it that you should think about purchasing and add to your library. Now, you can probably tell I'm not in my normal space here with these crazy times and with the in-laws at the moment. And I know this room is very echoey, so I apologize for the sound not being great. But hopefully you can still follow along well enough that you can follow what I'm talking about. So this is something I did a blog post on quite a while ago, and there are some texts I can add to this. But this is something I'm asked about a lot because, you know, with the Reformed, there are many popular systematic theology texts. There tend to be a lot that are popularized, that are used in seminaries, that are being written today. And just in terms of Lutheran systematics, major works, there aren't nearly as many today as there are in the Reformed world. However, that does not mean that there's not a vast catalog of texts that you can take a look at if you want some systematic theology. Oftentimes in Lutheran just parlance, we speak about dogmatic theology more than we do systematic theology, whereas systematic theology tends to be the more Reformed term. But whatever term you want to use, it's really the same kind of thing that we are talking about. So if you want to get something that's very short, comprehensive, a short single volume work, there are a few things that I would recommend there. We put out a couple different volumes in our American Lutheran Classic series. We have Biblical Dogmatics by A.G. Voigt. This is a very small, it's a very short introductory book, who is a Lutheran professor in the South. And we have Elements of Religion by Henry Eister Jacobs, which is another very short, basic volume giving the basic ideas behind every Loci of theology. So it goes through, you know, doctrine of God, doctrine of man, doctrine of angels, soteriology, and covers all of it in pretty short volumes. So those two volumes are both really good in giving you a basic overview of what Lutheran theology is, but they're not going to get that in depth because of the limits of the length. Another one is the Enchiridion by Martin Chemnitz. Martin Chemnitz being the greatest Lutheran theologian after Martin Luther, prior to Johann Gerhard. You know, there's a bit of a debate who's the better theologian, and it's pretty close between Chemnitz and Gerhard. But certainly the most significant theologian, at least between those two figures, and maybe just the second most significant figure in the history of Lutheranism after Martin Luther. So the Enchiridion is a small volume of his thoughts, a basic theology. He has a lot of other more extensive works, but that's a good one if you want something short and introductory. If you want something more modern that's very basic, there are a couple books that I can recommend. There is Called to Believe, Teach, and Confess by Stephen Mueller. It does not really follow the categories of classical dogmatics, which for that reason, it's not my favorite volume, but it's a pretty helpful volume, and I still would recommend getting a copy. The volume that I prefer, that is a more modern introductory volume, is God So Loved the World, a Summary of Christian Doctrine by Lyle Lang, who is in the Wisconsin Synod. This is a bigger volume. It's a bigger book, but it is very basic, and it spends quite a bit of time explaining everything that it talks about. He does use many of the categories of just classic Lutheran systematic theology, so that will give you a very good one-volume introduction to these ideas. So with that, let's talk about things that are maybe a little more in-depth. If you want something a little more in-depth than those, something a little longer, there are a few other things that I would recommend. If you want something that is still a single volume, A Summary of the Christian Faith by Henry Eister Jacobs, which we also publish in our American Lutheran Classic series. We have a second new edition of it. That is a single volume work. It's about 600 pages. It's very, very good. It's in a catechetical format, so it's questions and answers. He asks questions about each doctrine and then answers those questions. This is really, I say this is my favorite if you're going to purchase a one-volume systematic text, because it's very comprehensive, but also very readable. It's a very accessible work. Now, if you want something from the Missouri Synod, the Synodical Conference tradition, there is an excellent volume, which is called Christian Dogmatics by John Theodore Mueller. This is basically a summary of Francis Pieper's Christian Dogmatics. It is a really great single volume. I go back to it all the time. It's about at the same level of a summary of as a summary of the Christian faith by Henry Eyster Jacobs. If you do want, two very comprehensive single volume texts, those are the two by far that I would recommend getting. So again, very readable. It follows a lot of the just traditional Lutheran categories. He explains things very well. It's not going to be quite as in-depth as Francis Pieper's Christian Dogmatics, as this is basically a summarization of that work. So there's also, and maybe this should have been included in the first parts, Leonhard Hutter, who is a very early Lutheran theologian, has a book called The Compend of Lutheran Theology. And this is largely a compilation of quotes from Lutheran confessions themselves, as well as some of his own words. But this is a great single volume, pretty short, again, probably on the same level as like a Biblical Dogmatics or Elements of Religion. That's another great volume that you may want to pick up, especially if you want something early to see what was a very early approach to Lutheran systematic theology just after the confessions themselves were written. Another volume that I recommend, if you want, again, a single volume, which is really good, is The Christian Faith by Joseph Stump. This uses a lot of the categories of just the scholastic Lutheran method going throughout the 17th century. It's basically just a summary and one volume comprehensive look at those ideas, but also very readable. This is something that is out of print. It's been out of print for quite a while. I did acquire the rights to be able to print it, but we have not had the chance to put out our own edition of it yet, but that is something that has been in the works for quite a little while. And if you want a one-volume work that is a little more academic in its approach, there are two others that I would recommend before we get on to multi-volume systematics. The first is The Doctrinal Theology of the Evangelical Lutheran Church by Heinrich Schmid. Again, we do also publish this. This is in our Classics and Dogmatics series. But this is really just a summary of the theology of the 17th century. Now, the 17th century within Lutheranism was an era, as well as within the Reformed world, this was the era following the Reformation where the theology of the Reformation was really expanded, it was systematized, it was defended very rigorously in light of the Counter-Reformation of Rome, as well as trying to distinguish differences between the traditions coming out of the Reformation. So there is a lot of very strict kind of categorization of ideas and theologies and positions on various issues. So that's a great volume which just compiles quotes of a lot of those figures. And another volume that is within that tradition is Christian Dogmatics and Notes on the History of Dogma by Conrad Lindberg. This is not just quotes from those figures, but it uses a lot of the same categories, a lot of the Latin categories. It may be good to have a Latin dictionary on hand, honestly, when you're looking at that work, but it's a really great volume. We are also working on putting out an edition of that. So that's what I'm going to recommend in terms of one volume systematic theologies. Now, if you do want to read things that are longer, a multi-volume series, for example, then let's start talking about what some of the options there are. There's a more recent series that was just released. It's 2 volumes from Concordia Publishing House. It's called Confessing the Gospel, a Lutheran Approach to Systematic Theology. The goal of this is to be a modern dogmatics or a modern systematic theological text from the Missouri Synod. It goes through just the basic doctrinal categories: doctrine of God, doctrine of the Trinity, doctrine of Christ, 2 natures of Christ, just going topic by topic. It is really more done largely by exegetical theologians, honestly, than it is by systematic theologians. So as one who's very systematic in my thinking, it wasn't my favorite volume, my favorite 2 volumes. It's not my favorite set, just because it doesn't really use a lot of those classical categories that I think are really beneficial. With that being said, it's not that it's not worth looking at. It is definitely worth looking at. And what it does do really well is it gives a good biblical overview and really broad scope biblical overview of each doctrine. So the thing it does well is it starts with the Old Testament, goes through the New Testament, and it's written by many authors, so it has experts in various books of scripture expanding upon how those doctrines are developed. But with that being said, because it doesn't really have a strong background in those classical systematic categories, it's not personally my favorite, but you may find it very useful. And if you do want a comprehensive library, it's something that will be beneficial at times. So beyond that, there are many multi-volume series as well, and the one that's used most often more than anything else, especially by those within the Missouri Synod, is Christian Dogmatics by Francis Pieper. This is 3 volumes, and then there's a giant index at the end. This is still the standard text. It's 100 years old at this point, but it is the standard text of systematic theology, of dogmatic theology, within the more confessional conservative Lutheran tradition, at least in the United States of America. So it's a great series. There are, I think, shortcomings in it as well, but there are, of course, in any series. But if you want especially a good, comprehensive treatment, that is going to be one that is very standard within the Lutheran world, especially representing the Synodical Conference tradition, so the theology of people like C.F.W. Walther and then himself, Francis Pieper, this is the best place to go for that. There is another set of volumes that comes from that tradition, though, that is less well known, and this is the Evangelical Lutheran Dogmatics by Adolf Hoenecke. Now, Hoenecke is as comprehensive as Pieper, it's the same size as Pieper, and he was within the Wisconsin Synod rather than Missouri Synod. I have said many times that I really prefer Hoenecke. The reason I prefer him is he does work from a more traditional scholastic method, which means that his volumes are much more systematic in presentation. The problem that I have with Pieper is, as good as he is on many issues, he does not write systematically to the same extent that some others do, and because of that, he writes very polemically, and he's concerned about a number of issues that are going on at his time, and rightly so. But he tends to avoid lengthy discussions of topics that were not under debate, and I think for that reason, he's just a little imbalanced in terms of the amount of time he spends on each topic. Generally, what he says is very good, but Hoenecke is going to have a little more balanced approach in terms of how much time he spends on each topic. So, Adolf Hoenecke, 4-volume sets. These are not cheap, by the way, but they are worth the money if you really do want to delve into this. Now, a classic text that I'm going to recommend, which is 2 volumes, this is the Loci Theologici by Martin Chemnitz. These are 2 large volumes. This is the first major systematic theology in the post-Reformation era. It's really a commentary on Melanchthon, but Chemnitz develops many of his own ideas here. And the problem with these, though, is that in English, you don't have the entirety of the systematic theology, so certain topics are skipped. Only some things have been translated. A large portion of it's been translated, but there still are some missing topics. But nonetheless, what is there is fantastic. It is highly recommended. In fact, if you want to know Lutheran systematic theology, it's really a necessity to get a hold of Chemnitz, who is such a major figure there. Then we have the Theological Commonplaces by Johann Gerhard. The Missouri Synod is in process of publishing various translations of these volumes in hardcover. They are not cheap again, but they are excellent. They're the most comprehensive systematic theology that really is available from the Lutheran tradition. There is nothing better. I think Gerhard is the absolute best. There are some distinctions that occur within the systematic theological tradition of Lutheranism that haven't developed yet at the time of Gerhard, that kind of take till that next generation of thinkers. But for the most part, everything is going to be there in Gerhard. He writes extensively. His devotional works are excellent as well, but that's another topic. If you do want some cheaper Gerhard, you can look at Repristination Press, who puts out some newer translations of Gerhard as well. They're not going to be the same volumes that are put out by Concordia Publishing House, but they are a lot more affordable. So if you do want to just kind of get a taste of Gerhard and you can't afford the CPH volumes, check out the volumes by Repristination Press. I highly recommend those as well. Now, 2 others that I want to mention that are multi-volume. One is Revere Franklin Widener's texts. And if you know much about me, you know that I like Revere Franklin Widener. We named our institute, the Widener Institute, after him. And he wrote a series of books which would have been a complete systematic theology. He has wanted various doctrines. It was a 12-volume series, at least planned to be that way, but he never got around to finishing it. So we don't have volumes on the sacraments or eschatology or scripture. However, the other topics of systematic or doctrinal theology are covered by Widener. Now, Widener is someone I really appreciate. He's an American theologian, and he takes a lot of the developments of that scholastic era, and also he deals with a lot of the theological and scriptural developments in terms of understandings of scripture in the 19th century, and the good aspects of those, not the negative. And he combines a lot of that with a traditional Lutheran scholastic theology. So I recommend Widener. We're publishing his complete works. They're not all available at this point, but they will be at some point. if you want to check those out, go to jspublishing.org and pick up the volumes of Widener. So there is a great, more modern text, and by more modern I mean 100 years old at this point, but still more modern than many of the volumes that we're looking at from the 16th and 17th centuries. If you want something new, however, there is one series of books that is a multi-volume series that is in the process of being published. This is the Confessional Lutheran Dogmatics series, which is by multiple authors. There are some great volumes in that. Now, the volumes are of varying quality as they are different authors that are writing them. I highly recommend the volumes of David Scare, particularly his volume on baptism is very, very beneficial and helpful. But that is still in the process of being written at this point. It's been quite a while that it's been in process, so I don't know what the plan is in terms of the finality of these texts. But if you want something that is more modern, that is pretty thorough, then I would recommend checking those out. So that is my list of Lutheran systematic theology texts. Honestly, there are some others that I could mention as well that have both been influential within the Lutheran tradition and ones that some are good, some are not great. But these are the ones that I think are probably the best, and if I'm going to recommend that you look into the systematic tradition and all you do is read English, these are the ones that I am going to recommend. So anyway, hope you find these useful. If you want to check out some of these volumes from our own publishing house, go to jspublishing.org, and we'll see you next time. God bless.